Welcome back. So we're setting up our ability system components and we set our replication mode. Now something should still be bothering you at this point, and that is that our Aura character base class has an ability system component pointer and an attribute set pointer. And it's only on Aura enemy that those pointers have been set with valid values. For Aura character, those pointers are uninitialized because we constructed the ability system component and attribute set on the player state instead for our player controlled character. These pointers have valid values for the player state, but not for the character. So I want that to keep bothering you. Keep that in the back of your mind because it's something we do want to fix. Now, another thing we have to do is make sure that the ability system component itself knows who its owner is. Now, that could mean something different for our enemy versus our player-controlled character, right? Because for our enemy, the owner of the ability system component is clearly this enemy class. But for the character, that's not necessarily the case, is it? Because the player state is who actually constructs the ability system component. So how do we decide who's the owner of it? Let's talk about that. Now, the ability system component has this concept of ability actor info. That way, it has this concept of ability actor info. That way, the ability system component can always know the actor info, such as who owns this ability system component. But the ability system component also understands the concept that it might be owned by some actor, by some pawn, or it could be owned by another type of entity such as a player state. So for that reason, the ability system component has two variables, an owner actor and an avatar actor. You see, the owner actor is whatever class actually owns the ability system component, but the avatar actor is the representation in the world associated with this ability system component. Now, for our enemy character, these two are the same because our enemy character class is the class that constructs our ability system component. So the owner actor is the enemy character, and the avatar actor is also the enemy character. That's what we see in the world. That's the visual representation. Now, for the player-controlled character, this is a little different because our ability system component is constructed by the player state. And that's the class we would like to think of as the owner for the ability system component. So the owner actor in this case should be the player state. And the avatar actor, that actor that we actually see in the world, that should be the character. So in this case, the owner actor and avatar actor are two different actors, and the ability system component distinguishes between those two. So it's important to understand that the owner actor and avatar actor may or may not be the same actor. In our project, for the enemy, they are the same, and for the player-controlled character, they are different. Now, we are the ones who decide these things. We call the function to set the owner and avatar actors. It's a function on the ability system component called init ability actor info. So we need to initialize the ability system component with these actors ourselves. Now, where and when do we call this function? Well, that's something that we have to give some thought to. You see, it depends. Now, here are some rules of thumb and good places to do so in a multiplayer game. The first thing we need to know is that calling init ability actor info must be done after possession. In other words, the controller has to have been set for the pawn. So it's important that we do this after the controller has been set for the pawn. So when is that? Well, for a player-controlled character in which the ability system component lives on the pawn itself, this would be if perhaps we had constructed the ability system component on Aura character instead of the player state, which we're not doing, but if we did, a good important that we do this after and good places to do so in a multiplayer game. The first thing we need to know is that calling init ability actor info must be done after possession. In other words, the controller has to have been set for the pawn, so it's important that we do this after the controller has been set for the pawn. So when is that? Well, for a player controlled character in which the ability system component lives on the pawn itself. This would be if perhaps we had constructed the ability system component on aura character instead of the player state, which we're not doing, but if we did, controller has to have been set for the pawn. So it's important that we do this after the controller has been set for the pawn. So when is that? Well, for a player controlled character in which the ability system, the first thing we need to know is that calling init ability actor info, when do we call this function? Well, that's something that we have to give some thought to. You see, it depends. Here are some rules of thumb and good places to do so in a multiplayer game. The first thing we need to know is that calling init ability actor info must be done after possession. In other words, the controller has to have been set for the pawn. So it's important that we do this after the controller has been set for the pawn. So when is that? Well, for a player-controlled character in which the ability system component lives on the pawn itself, this would be if perhaps we had constructed the ability system component on aura character instead of the player state, which we're not doing, but if we did, a good place to call init ability actor info would be in the possessed by function on the pawn. This ensures that the ability system component is initialized with the avatar actor and owner actor values on the server. But this function only applies on the server. On the client, we have to use a different function. There's a function called acknowledge possession for that. And in this function, we know that possession has occurred. Our pawn does have a valid controller. So in this case, if we were to put our ability system component on the pawn, or in our case, the character class itself, these two functions are where we would call init ability actor info in order to initialize the ability system so it knows who its owners are, both the owner and the avatar. And in this case, they would both be the same. They would be the pawn itself. Now, for player-controlled characters in which the ability system component lives on the player state, which is our case for aura character, then we're going to call init ability actor info for the server on possessed by. But for the client, we're not going to use acknowledge possession. We're going to use on rep player state. Why? Because our ASC, our ability system component, lives on the player state. So not only do we need to make sure that our controller has been set, but we also need to make sure that our player state is valid at this point in time as well. Now, on rep player state is safe. Both of those things will have been done by that point in time. We'll have a valid controller and a valid player state. Now, on rep player state is something called a rep notify. Rep notifies are functions that are called as a result of something being replicated. In this case, the player state will have been set on the server, and the player state is a replicated entity, which means that as soon as that player state has been set for our pawn, that will be replicated down, triggering this rep notify, which will be called in response to the replication happening. And at that point, we know that our player state has been set on the server and down here on the client. As soon as that player state has been set for our pawn, that will be replicated down, triggering this rep notify, which will be called in response to the replication happening. And at that point, we know that our player state has been set on the server and down here on the client. It's been replicated down and it's a valid pointer. So that is where we will initialize ability actor info for our ability system component. And in this case, we will be setting our owner actor to the player state and our avatar actor to the pawn itself, in our case, or a character. So this is what we'll be doing for our player controlled character. Now for the AI controlled characters, it's a bit more simple. For our AI controlled characters, we'll have our ability system component on the pawn itself. That's our aura enemy. And because of that, we really only need to call init ability actor info in begin play. We know that our AI controlled character is going to have a valid ability system component and controller, and we're just going to call init ability actor info in begin play. This will work just fine for our AI controlled character, so that's what we're going to do. So if you're a note taker, if you like taking notes, this would be one of those important things to write down. So you can pause the video and write these things down, because these are the functions that you want to know about when it comes to calling init ability actor info and initializing it. And now that we know what we're going to do to init ability actor info, it's time to actually do it in our project. And this is going to be your quest. I want you to initialize the actor info by calling init ability actor info. And you're going to do this for the aura enemy class. That's going to be easy. You'll just do it in begin play, right? But also handle this for aura character. And remember, this one's a little bit more complicated. And also remember, the ASC, the ability system component, is on the player state, which means you're going to need to access the player state. And while you're at it, this is a great opportunity to set the aura character's ability system component and attribute set pointers. Remember, I told you that should be bothering you in the back of your mind. Those pointers are uninitialized. Well, as soon as we access the player state, we should then have access to the ability system component and attribute sets. The player state has getters for those, and our aura character will now have the ability to set those pointers. So pause the video and initialize your ability actor info now. Okay, so we're ready to init ability